Hello guys, I found myself on a nice February day, the sun's shining. Actually, there's just some snow on the ground a couple hours ago. It's all melted off. I'm out here in a short sleeve shirt, listening to the dogs run. And found myself sitting up here. I don't know if y'all can really see it or not. Sitting up here on top of these burnt out logs. I got to looking, and there's a little pool of water there. That pool of water, it got me thinking about somebody. I don't know if anybody's ever heard the story of old Rip Van Winkle. Old Rip, he's a pretty fine feller, well thought of. Wasn't necessarily the smartest guy, wasn't necessarily the richest guy. But when he went to town, everybody knew him. Everybody considered him at least an acquaintance, if not a friend. But old Rip, he had him a couple kids. He's getting up in age. His wife, and old Rip, he worked a lot. He had to support the kids and the wife, and he was a busy man, but he had one thing that, so to speak, kept him grounded. Old Rip was about like me. He was a houndsman. He had him a couple good old dogs, and one day Rip, he decided after work that he'd go out and run the dogs for a while, see if they could circle a rabbit or two back around. And old Rip, he went out to his favorite spot. There's a little clearing in the edge of the woods. Usually a rabbit or two sitting around there. So he put the dogs in, and old Rip, he found himself in a spot real similar to this. Just sitting up here thinking about life and everything else. But old Rip, he got to thinking, he said, man, I've worked so hard. There goes the rabbit. You can see it right there. But said, man, I've been working hard. I'd sure love to have a good sleep. He said, pretty sunshiny evening. He said, I could just stretch out here and just sleep for 100 years. Well, about the time he said that, he heard something scurrying down below him. And he looked, thinking it was one of the dogs. And right down here below him popped out a little person. First, Rip, he said, man, I know I'm tired, but that looks like a person. He had a little pointy hat, big old nose, about like myself, covered in dirt, beard down to his belly button. Rip, he didn't know whether to jump off his perch or what to do, so he just kind of stood there. After a minute, the little guy, he looked back up at him. He said, Rip, he said, I heard what you was saying, and I've got a deal for you. He said, I've got what you need. Rip said, you do? He said, yes, sir. He said, I got exactly what you need. Rip said, what's that? He said, rest. He said, this water in this log down here, that's an enchanted pool of water. He said the story was that years and years ago, Mother Earth came down and stuck her finger tip right there in that water. She said, any man who drinks from this water can have a wish. Well, Rip, he thought, there ain't nothing much else that I'd rather have than a good night's sleep right now. So, he reached down, took him a scoop of water, put it to his lips, and surprising enough, it was the best drink of water he'd ever tasted in his life. Well, he looked back down. The little feller, he was gone. Must have crawled back in the hole he came out of. Rip said, man, I don't know if I've ever witnessed anything more crazy in all my life. But he said, I tell you one thing. Oh, man. I'm a-getting tired. Well, Rip, he settled on down. Oh, stretched out right above that little enchanted pool of water. Pulled his hat down over his face. And the next thing you know, old Rip, he was out of it. And he slept. And he slept. And he slept some more. One day, Rip, he looked around. Well, everything had changed. That little clearing that he'd sat down in on that log, it wasn't a clearing no more. It was an entire field. He could see all across the hills. He looked, he said, Lord, what has happened? About that time, he looked down, and right in the same very spot was that little feller standing there with his little pointy hat and his big old nose and everything else. He looked up at Rip and he said, Rip, did you have your good sleep? Yeah, I tell you what, little feller, I feel like I've slept for at least 100 years. And the little guy laughed and he said, well, Rip, that's what you asked for. And Rip said, well, no, I didn't. And he said, I just wanted a good night's sleep. Little feller said, no, I heard you before I came out of my hole say that you could sleep for 100 years. Well, that's the wish that you was granted when you drank out of that enchanted pool of water. Rip said, well, there ain't no way. He said, no man can sleep for 100 years. Little feller said, well, the man that drinks out of that can do whatever he chooses to, but he only gets one chance. That's the only sip of water, Rip. No more for you. And with that, Rip, he looked around, looking for his old hound dogs, listening for them, didn't hear them. He looked back down. Little feller was gone. Well, now, Rip said, I don't know what in the world I've got into, but man, I ain't never felt like I slept so long in all my life. And with that, he stroked his face. And he kept going and going. And he felt. And old Rip, he looked down, and his beard was longer than the little feller's. Well, that's odd, he said. I just trimmed my beard the other day. Then he looked at his hands. His hands, what used to be, rough and calloused from work, man, they was so smooth and felt so good, but golly, they was wrinkled. I said, why did I get all these wrinkles for? This can't be right. Well, Rip, he stood up about that time. Oh! And looked around. I never thought he could see so far. Well, Rip went on. He finally jumped down off his perch, strode off to town. Well, he got to town and he saw the oddest sight that there ever was. There was a wagon, but it didn't have no horses or mules or ox, not even a goat tied to it, pulling it. It had this loud smoke coming out of it. Man, it stunk too, way worse than anything a horse could let out of it. Rip said, that ain't right. What in the world? He said, what is this thing? Where am I at? Well, he looked around and he saw the drugstore where even when he's a little boy, he used to go in and buy him a soda pop. And that's where all the news was gathered up. So he walked in, opened the door. Wasn't not one person that he recognized in there. And it was a busy day. Well, about that time, the door slammed behind him as he walked in, and everybody looked around. And you ought to have saw some of the looks that old Rip got. He said, well, he said, what's everybody looking at? They said, feller, we ain't never seen nothing so homely looking in all our lives. They said, what kind of hole did you just crawl out of? He said, well, he said, I don't know. He said, I woke up in the woods. Everything was different. Huh. Yeah, it was different, all right. Old Rip, he didn't even know where he was at, what he was doing. Well, with that, old Rip, he just couldn't take it no more. He turned, bust right out that door, and took off walking right down Main Street and straight on to the little cabin where him and his wife and kids lived. He was walking down through there and he looked up on the hill. The big tree next to the house was gone. Well, actually, it wasn't gone. Weird enough, it looked like it had just been moved over a little bit. He said, well, that ain't right. Walked up there, top of the little knoll where the house sat, and instead of his little cabin, there was a big 2-story house. Pretty house. Nice one. Well, he walked up to it, and, oh man, at this point, old Rip, I'd say he was about shot. He walked up to on the porch, knocked on the door, and a man walked out and opened the door. He's probably in his 40s, 50s, somewhere around in there. And he said, mister, he said, are you all right? And Rip, he looked at him square in the face and he said, no, I'm not all right. He said, this used to be my house, but my house didn't look like this house. And my big tree out in the yard, it used to be over yonder. Well, now it's over here. Well, the guy looked at him real puzzled, squinted his eyes. He covered the shade over his eyes. He looked. He said, Rip? Rip, hearing his name, he nodded. The guy looked at him and he said, you are Rip, aren't you? You're Rip Van Winkle. He said, yes, sir. Only one I know of. That guy had the most puzzled look on his face. Face turned white as a sheet, looked like he'd seen a ghost. Well, he looked at Rip one more time. He said, mister, if that's who you are, you're my grandpa. Well, with that, Rip really was puzzled. His kids, I mean, they was getting up in age. Oldest one was 16. Sissy was 14, going on. The two little ones, they was growing like weeds too. But they wasn't going to be having no kids, let alone a 40 or 50-year-old man. With that, old Rip, he just didn't know what to say. And the guy looked at him, and he said, what happened to you? And Rip looked at him square in the face, and he said, I've learned a very valuable lesson. The guy said, what's that? He said, never ask for more than you think that you can handle. 100 years is a long time. And now, nothing is what it used to be, and what used to be will never be again. Well, Rip, I like to think that, you know, he might have went out and found him another hound dog or two. Sort of like that right down there. I don't know how the story ended, But I think that we can all learn something from Rip. Sometimes that we think that we got it so bad. We wish for this and we wish for that. All we end up doing is wishing our life away. So that's my little story. It's just kind of hit me out here. Figured I'd share it with somebody. I hope y'all enjoy. Hope y'all have a blessed day.